How is Vice President Harris performing with young voters compared to how President Biden did in 2020?
So some numbers, Anderson, to help with that question. Number one, just look at this choice for president. I want to stretch this out a little bit. Excuse me for turning my back. This is from a recent New York Times Siena poll. It shows Donald Trump and the vice president tied among voters aged 18 to 29. Joe Biden carried that group by 24 points in 2020 in the exit polls. From being on the ground, remember, when you poll a smaller subgroup in a poll, there's a bigger margin of error. I can't quite believe it's a tie from being on the ground several times in Michigan, but there's no question the vice president is doing better than President Biden was doing earlier this year, when a lot of young voters didn't want him to be the candidate anymore. But she's not doing as well as he did back in 2020. There's no doubt about that.
So for the past several days, we've been talking pretty extensively about how JD Vance absolutely crushed Tim Walz in that VP debate. But that said, elections are not really won by vice presidential debates. So where does the 2024 presidential election currently really stand? And on that front, you had CNN recently admitting that Tim Walz got absolutely destroyed. But on top of that, they recently ran a segment explaining why Donald Trump is doing way better with this key demographic group than any Republican in modern history. And we'll give you those details in a second. But first, let me just say that if you are new to the channel, make sure you are subscribed. Okay, your subscription goes a long way in ensuring we can keep bringing you videos like this. It is election year. Censorship is rampant as usual. And of course, subscribing also allows you to stay on top of all of our breaking news content. So please go down below, hit that red subscribe button. And with that said, take a listen to this segment that CNN recently ran about the state of the polls.
Points that just jump off the screen should set off sirens. All right, this is union households. This is Democratic margin in presidential election. It ain't what it used to be. You know, you go back to 1992, Bill Clinton won that union vote by 30 points. Hillary Clinton only won it by 12 points back in 2016. That was the lowest mark for a Democrat since 1984, Mondale versus Reagan. But look at where Kamala Harris is today. She's only leading by 9 points. That would be the worst Democratic performance in a generation, 10 points off the mark of Joe Biden, who of course won 4 years ago, was sort of that union guy, Union Joe, right? Won it by 19 points. She's 10 points off his mark, and the worst in a generation if this, in fact, holds, Sarah.
It is interesting to note that the difference between this, and Biden still won.
Still won.
But those numbers are significantly down. All right, talk to me about...
So, I mean, you see the numbers right here. In 2020, Biden won union workers by 19 points. According to the official narrative, he carried the Rust Belt because of that. In 2016, narrowly, by the way, let's remember that it was very close. In 2016, Hillary Clinton only got 12 points an advantage on the union vote. And because of that, she lost Michigan, she lost PA, and she lost Wisconsin. Currently, Kamala Harris is polling at only +9, which is way down. And by the way, is something that's not exactly surprising or unpredictable. Obviously, Kamala Harris does not have nearly the appeal that Scranton Joe had in the Rust Belt with the white working class. We'll talk more about this second and show you more of what the CNN polling analysts had to say. But first, a word from today's sponsor over at Ground News. Folks, you've heard me complain about how today's media fails to represent the views of the majority of Americans, especially conservatives. They tend to push liberal narratives while sidelining others, creating a massive disconnect with so many Americans. That's why I've partnered with Ground News to show you an easy way to get past all the bias and approach current events with a more balanced perspective. Ground News is an app that gathers news from both left and right-wing sources on the same topic, so that way you can form your own opinion based on every perspective. They even take it a step further with their blind spot feed that exposes the left's selective reporting. It surfaces important stories barely getting attention, like this one on how California lawmakers are passing a bill that could make undocumented immigrants eligible for home loans, which is absolutely insane. Ground News found just over 50 articles covering this, with only 9% of that reporting coming from left-wing sources. Like the LA Times writing that this program would just benefit eligible first-time buyers, including immigrants, quote, in good standing. Nobody knows what that means. While right-leaning National Review points out that this program is severely lacking funding even for U.S. citizens and would exacerbate the state's ongoing housing crunch. With it being an election year, I really think news like this can change the outcome of elections and even the trajectory of this country, but only if you are aware of them in the first place, and I trust ground news to help out with that. So stay fully informed on the news that can easily become sensationalized by the mainstream media, like the 2024 election, by visiting ground.news/VinceDao. Again, that is ground.news/VinceDao, or scan the QR code on my screen. My viewers save up to 40% on the same Vantage plan that I use for unlimited access to all of their features. So be sure to go check them out. Obviously, on election year, a very useful resource to say the least, as well as this channel, obviously. But that said, let's continue with this.
Manual labor, those folks who went to trade schools.
Yeah, those folks who use their hands. I think a lot of people oftentimes conflate the union vote with those who use their hands. Mike Rowe, of course, has been arguing more people should go to trade schools, more people should get a vocational degree. Look at this margin. This, to me, oh boy, does this tell you about the state of our politics now versus back in the early 1990s. Margin among vocational and trade school grads in pre-election polling. Bill Clinton was leading that vote over George H.W. Bush by 7 points. Look at where Donald Trump is today over Kamala Harris, a 31-point advantage. When I think people think of the working class, they think of people who use their hands, and we know that Donald Trump has been going after that vote, and he is in a very strong position, more so perhaps than any other bloc. The folks who go to trade school, vocational school, that has moved from being a core Democratic group to now being a core group of Donald Trump's massive amount of support among the working class.
Wow. And that's something that should be thoroughly understood, which is that, as you can see here from this graphic, Democrats have been losing that white working class for a very long time. Now, whatever you want to say about the 2020 election, the simple reality of what the numbers were is not that Biden blew out Donald Trump, but that he did just enough with the white working class vote, specifically in that Rust Belt, to stop the bleeding and kind of just get a little bit over the hump. But this has been a trend that is favoring Republicans for a very long time. And obviously the fact that Trump has a very unique populist appeal that many other GOP candidates don't have is part of the reason you see him up right now by 31 points. We'll talk more about this in a second, but once again, let's see what the CNN guy has to say more.
All right, let's move on to voters of color. And there's a very specific group that you looked at. And what are you seeing there?
Yeah, you know, we have been noting on this program, right, that Donald Trump seems to have been having some real impact among voters of color, getting into that traditional Democratic support. And I was very interested to see this because we're talking about the working class, right? So this is the margin among non-college graduates, all right, the voters of color. You go back 4 years ago, look at that. Joe Biden won that group by 45 points. Look at where Kamala Harris's support is today. She's still leading amongst that group, but that lead is down 17 points to just 28 points. And I will note that the margin among voters of color who actually graduate college has only been changed by 5 points. 5 points compared to 4 years ago. The reason Donald Trump is doing so well amongst voters of color is because he has really gone in and grabbed a lot of voters that he didn't previously have among those who didn't graduate college. And this is part of a larger trend that we're seeing throughout our politics era, in which Republicans, specifically Donald Trump, is doing very, very well among working class voters, whether they were in unions, whether they went to trade school, or whether they're voters of color. The fact is Donald Trump seems to have gone into a hotbed of traditional Democratic support and made a lot of movement in ways I don't think a lot of people would have thought when he went down that escalator just back in 2015.
All right, Harry Ensign bringing us the numbers as they look right.
So there you have it. Again, Donald Trump seeming to enjoy historic support among union workers, among the working class, primarily the white working class, but even, as he pointed out there at the end, even the non-white working class has shifted by pretty significant margins in Donald Trump's favor. I mean, whatever the margin of error is, 17 points in a close election among any demographic group is a pretty big deal. And I genuinely believe this type of thing is going to be the X factor for Trump. The fact that Kamala Harris cannot match the appeal that Scranton Joe had with union people, etc. back in 2020. And I break that down by every single state. I'll give you a few here, like keys to the election in terms of these swing states. So obviously in the Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan specifically, that working class union vote is going to go a long way. Kamala Harris is struggling with them. In Michigan, the auto industry and those unions is pretty big. You have a big industrial base in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin as well. So that's obviously a pretty big deal. But by the way, it's worth noting that the Rust Belt states are not the only places in the country where the union vote makes a big difference. You know where else it does? Nevada. The culinary unions and their vote out of the Las Vegas metro area essentially control the entirety of Nevada politics, and the political machine that union built for a long time was ensuring permanent Democrat control of the state. But as you can see, largely because of the Democrat governor screwing up COVID in 2020, as well as Trump doing a good job of appealing to them with ideas like no tax on tips, that union support for the Democrats is starting to collapse. And that can also make the difference in the Sunbelt states like Nevada. In Arizona, we have another statistic that the CNN guy kind of alluded to there at the end, but that is record Hispanic support, or at the very least support among Latinos, that will not match what Biden had in 2020. Back in 2020, Biden won the Latino vote in Arizona by an estimated margin of 65 to 75%. Now in 2024, Kamala Harris is polling nationally among Latinos very close to 50-50. And in a narrow swing state like Arizona, getting 50-50 of the Latino vote is not nearly enough. And by the way, that really shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Hispanics have been trending away from the Democrat Party for the past few years now. But again, if it splits very close to 50-50, one half for Kamala Harris, the demographic numbers do not exist for her to win that state either. And so when you kind of consider these numbers and add it all up, Donald Trump has a few important X factors in this election in certain swing states that may very well deliver him victory. You add a few things on top of that. For instance, in Wisconsin, demographics significantly favor Trump of those Rust Belt states. The highest ratio of white working class voters, not a very big metropolitan area in that state. In PA, for instance, that's the state where he was shot in. Right? In that Butler, PA region where you need to maximize, run up the turnout among white working class voters there. Hey, no one is making light of the assassination attempt, but it is an objective fact that is going to drive extra enthusiasm. You saw that in the new voter registrations for Republicans in the months of July and August. That's going to make a difference. In Michigan, you also have the Muslim voters who are not happy with Kamala Harris and are currently looking like they will stay home and boycott the election. Again, add this all up. These are the keys to Donald Trump's path to victory. And currently, based on the polls, they're starting to look decent. With that said, do not get complacent. Make sure you have a plan to vote. Just like a nice performance at the VP debate, polls do not decide elections. Your vote does. So make sure you cast your vote either on election day or before election day, but make sure it gets there. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, check out our friends over at Ground News, and until next time, God bless and peace.